Greetings to each one of you in that precious name of Jesus, and I feel like we're sitting in the mercy seat this morning, and to be able to experience God's glory in such a tangible way as we worship together is just a beautiful, beautiful gift. And so I would like for the continuation of this worship service to be exactly that, for us to stay in that beautiful presence of recognizing God for who He is, recognizing ourselves for who we are, and then enjoying just the awesome beauty of that relationship, of having the privilege for us to experience the holiness and the goodness of God and not be consumed. It's a miracle. And thank you, choir, for sharing that and leading us in worship. I'd like to move into a subject this morning that I've entitled Making a Difference. Making a difference. And the verse that phrase comes from is from the book of Jude. Interesting, Mark made mention of this book. In verse 22 it says, "And of some have compassion, making a difference, and others save with fear, pulling them out of the fire, hating even the garment spotted by the flesh." Now, my subject this morning is not specifically a subject of evangelism necessarily. It's more as I take a step back in my own life and ask myself the question, am I making a difference? Or how am I making a difference with my life? And how is that impacting my family? And then how is my family contributing to our church and to the congregation here? And then how is our congregation making an impact in our community? And the theme verse this morning, I invite you to 2 Kings chapter 19. I was looking for a subject for this morning. I was looking for inspiration, and I went through some notes that I make different times. Might be through another sermon being preached, it might be through a devotional, or just one of those moments while you're going to work where you have inspiration that hits. And so I was going through that list, which was not very long, and I had this verse written down. 2 Kings chapter 19 and verse 30. 2 Kings 19 and verse 30. We are breaking into a thought here, into a story. But verse 30 says, "And the remnant that is escaped of the house of Judah shall yet again take root downward and bear fruit upward." So as we consider how can you and I make a difference with our lives, I'd like to present that word picture of having your life and my life being a plant or a tree that takes root downward and bears fruit upward. And as you consider planting gardens or flowers, or even reseeding your lawn to try to have more grass than weeds, this is a necessary part. And I feel somewhat guilty. We want more grass on our lawn, and so this spring we went and bought an enormous sack of grass seed and took turns just walking behind that spreader and watching that grass seed just be spread out quite evenly across the entire lawn. And we're looking forward to a really lush lawn this year. But that's all we did. That's it. We didn't do any soil prep. We didn't cover the seed. We didn't work it into the ground. We just dropped a lot of bare seed onto some parts or just bare parched ground. And so to expect some real amazing results is going to be somewhat of a miracle. And the rains have been coming at just the right times. So even that's in our favor, because we sure are not planning to water the entire lawn. And so if that grass is going to produce or even survive more than just sprouting, like the parable of the sower, those roots are going to have to go down. And unfortunately, the soil content on our property has very, very little to offer anything to grow besides trees somehow. And so we'll see what happens with that project and with those goals and ideals. But the bottom line is, for that grass to become rooted is going to be the only way that it's going to survive, especially when July and August come and there's not usually a whole lot of extra rain. Taking root downward and then producing and bearing fruit upward gives you a very healthy picture of something that is stable, something that is established, and something that will survive through various challenges that come. If we look further in chapter 19, actually in chapter 20, we have a story of Hezekiah. And I would like now, for the next couple minutes, to compare 3 or 4 different individuals, and we're going to look at the word indifference this morning. I have 4 different examples of people who had decisions to make, who had choices to make, and we see the impact of not only their specific choices, but also we're concerned about their attitude to what was happening. And so in order for me to make positive, and I'm going to add passionate growth in my experience, which will then influence my family, which will then influence our church community, or our church congregation, which will then influence our community, there is something required for stable growth that I think as humans we find challenging. We have inspiration, and I'm trusting that by the end of this sermon this morning, you along with me will have renewed inspiration, which is beautiful. There is nothing wrong with inspiration. I was enormously inspired last Sunday morning and enjoyed the sermon immensely. What have I retained? Or what has that changed about how I live? What did I do differently Monday morning of last week than I would have Saturday morning? So how much did my life change or benefit from that enormous inspiration, as beautiful as it was? How can I implement positive, passionate growth in my experience and not live life purely by inspiration? 2 Kings chapter 20, and we'll look at verse 19. 2 Kings chapter 20 and verse 19. Then said Hezekiah unto Isaiah, Good is the word of the Lord which thou hast spoken. And he said, Is it not good if peace and truth be in my days? So we take more of this story, starting at verse 1 of chapter 20. Hezekiah becomes deathly ill. And so, as he was in bed, he was prepared to die. And he was pretty discouraged about this. And Isaiah the prophet came to Hezekiah and said in verse 1, Thus saith the Lord, Set thine house in order, for thou shalt die and not live. Hezekiah, verse 2, turned his face to the wall and prayed unto the Lord, saying, I beseech thee, O Lord, remember now how I have walked before thee in truth, and with a perfect heart, and have done that which is good in thy sight. And Hezekiah wept sore. Put yourself into Hezekiah's situation. I didn't research what his age was, but let's say we just apply that to every one of us with the age that we are right now. And we're sick in bed. We have a terminal illness. And a word comes from the Lord that says, you are not going to outlive this. So set your house in order. Make arrangements, thorough arrangements for your passing. Set your house in order. Hezekiah's response to this, as he got this news that he was not going to recover, his response in verse 3 was to remind God of how well he had done. And I want to be fair. If we would turn to 2 Chronicles chapter 32, be interesting. Maybe we'll do that in a few minutes. Because this story was, God was very involved here. And so when he gave him this news, and then in the next few verses, Isaiah comes back and says, I have another word from the Lord for you. God is going to give you an extension of life for another 15 years. And Hezekiah's response, in 2 Chronicles, we read that God told Isaiah, I am going to give Hezekiah a test. All right? So, Hezekiah, you're going to die. That was the first message. And he wept sore. He was sad. He said, God, I've served you in truth. I've walked before you in truth with a perfect heart, and have done that which is good in thy sight. In other words, I don't deserve this. Is this what I deserve? Is this all I'm worth? God, have you forgotten? I was your man. So God says, let's see how Hezekiah does. We're going to give him another 15 years. Unfortunately, in response, so Hezekiah wanted a sign in verse 10. He said, how do I know this is true? I'm going to get another 15 years? Really? Give me a sign. Isaiah said, what do you want it to be? And he's like, well, how about 10 degrees on, I take it, the sundial? And let's rewind the time of day by 10 degrees. He's like, you know what? If it would fast forward 10 degrees, it'd be like, yeah, that's the laws of nature. It kind of just automatically goes that way. And if it shifted, we're not proving a whole lot. How about we back it up? And Isaiah said, as you've said, we're going to do this. Verse 11, Isaiah the prophet cried unto the Lord, and he brought the shadow 10 degrees backward, by which it had gone down in the dial of Ahaz. And so, 10 minutes, or I say 10 minutes, 10 degrees, it shifted back. So that was another miracle. Now look at Hezekiah's response, okay? You've been given, now you were on your deathbed, you were told, set your house in order. I'm not going to live to be 40. I just had a birthday, but this is the extent. Yeah, but God, I've been faithful all my life. Set your house in order. Now, I get another 15 years. And his response, verse 12, at that time, Berodach Baladan, the son of Baladan, king of Babylon, sent letters and a present unto Hezekiah, for he had heard that Hezekiah had been sick. Very nice gesture. And Hezekiah hearkened unto them, and showed them all the house of his precious things, the silver, and the gold, and the spices, and the precious ointment, and all the house of his armor, and all that was found in his treasures. There was nothing in his house, nor in all his dominion, that Hezekiah showed them not. And Isaiah responded, came back, and he says, what did y'all show them? And Hezekiah said, everything. I showed them everything, all my treasures. There's nothing that I have that I did not show them. And verse 16, Isaiah said unto Hezekiah, hear the word of the Lord. Behold, the days come that all that is in thine house, and that which thy fathers have laid up in store unto this day, shall be carried into Babylon. Nothing shall be left, saith the Lord. And of thy sons that shall issue from thee, which thou shalt beget, shall they take away, and they shall be eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon. And now Hezekiah's response. Then said Hezekiah unto Isaiah, good is the word of the Lord which thou hast spoken. And he said, is it not good if peace and truth be in my days? Hezekiah's response was one of indifference, of complacency. You know what? If I'm comfortable and I'm safe for the next 15 years, that's fine. What would cause him to have this attitude after having been gifted another 15 years? 2 Chronicles chapter 32. I want to be fair with Hezekiah. 2 Chronicles 32. And my understanding, to be fair, is that he repented of his pride. I have a few verses written down to notice. Chapter 32 and verse 23. Verse 23 to 26, and many brought gifts unto the Lord to Jerusalem, and presents to Hezekiah king of Judah, so that he was magnified in the sight of all nations from thenceforth. In those days Hezekiah was sick to the death, and prayed unto the Lord, and he spake unto him, and gave him a sign. But Hezekiah rendered not again according to the benefit done unto him, for his heart was lifted up. Therefore there was wrath upon him, and upon Judah and Jerusalem. His heart was lifted up. He was proud. He was full of himself. After having lived seemingly a lifetime of diligent, passionate service for God, now with this extension of life, it seemed the focus was all on him. Verse 26, notwithstanding, Hezekiah humbled himself for the pride of his heart, both he and the inhabitants of Jerusalem, so that the wrath of the Lord came not upon them in the days of Hezekiah. And so God did delay the judgment to the inhabitants of Jerusalem beyond Hezekiah's lifetime. And so I don't want this morning to just paint Hezekiah as someone who was just all about himself. There was for this stage in his life, but now we have indication that also due to him humbling himself. So I want to be fair with that picture. Also in verse 31, howbeit in the business of the ambassadors of the princes of Babylon, who sent unto him to inquire of the wonder that was done in the land, God left him to try him, that he might know all that was in his heart. And so when those men sent those gifts and that letter and said, Hezekiah, we've heard such amazing things about you. We want to come and see how God has blessed you. Hezekiah succumbed to that. And instead of sending a letter back or inviting them over and saying, here's the kingdom that God has built for himself, to display his glory, instead Hezekiah succumbed to their appreciation of him and said, yeah, look at all my stuff. And he showed them everything. And then that was what these same neighbors came later and carried away. So that's the example of Hezekiah. And I've labeled him as indifferent and complacent. Another example we have is Eli. 1 Samuel 3, verse 18. Samuel is called by God, Samuel, Samuel, and he went to Eli. We know the familiar story. And then he said, Lord, here am I. And speak, for thy servant heareth. And so God gave Samuel a message to share with Eli. And so Samuel in 1 Samuel 3:18 told Eli every whit and hid nothing from him. And again, the message that Samuel had for Eli was a message of judgment. Because he said, you have witnessed how your sons have done something sinful in the worship of the tabernacle, and you didn't do anything about it. You allowed that, you knew about it, and you turned your back on the sin that was happening under his watch, you could say. Also an attitude of indifference and complacency. Samuel's response, and he said, it is the Lord, let him do what seemeth him good. Very disappointing again. And in case I forget, to make an example of these men is not my intent to somehow make any of us comfortable. Instead, as we see these men respond to real challenges, real life experience, I easily see myself in their situation. And we'd like to ask some questions later. What can contribute to my feeling justified with my indifference and complacency? What factors influence me to have that same attitude today? Another example was Joash. He met with the prophet, 2 Kings 13, and the prophet said, take the arrows. And he took these arrows. First, so I'll just tell you the story. The prophet comes and says, take up a bow and arrows. All right, so he grabs a bow and the arrows. And he's like, shoot out the window. All right, so away he goes and he shoots an arrow. And he said, that's the example of you smiting the Syrians, I believe it was. So then with the arrows that he had left, okay, lay the bow down, he says, smite them on the ground. And so Joash, the king, he takes these arrows and he goes over to a stone and he goes 1, 2, 3. 3 hits on the ground. And he's done. I feel like maybe he did it even less passionately than I just did. 3 hits on the ground. And the prophet said, and he smote thrice and stayed. He stopped. And the story goes on where the prophet rebukes him and says, Joash, you should have like 5 or 6 times at least because with the energy that you were hitting the ground with those arrows was going to be the extent of deliverance, of how many times you're going to overcome the Syrians. And so in this case, you're going to overcome them 3 times because you hit the ground 3 times. You should have kept wailing away on that ground, because you would have destroyed the Syrians with that kind of energy. He said at least 5 or 6 times you should have hit the ground, and the Syrians would have been completely destroyed, consumed, off the face of the earth. But because 3 times, yeah, that's probably good, that attitude was not what he needed. And now in contrast, one more example is Job. In chapter 1, after all the calamity that is just bombarding his life, circumstances, everything Satan could devise to try to destroy Job's faith in God. And it just came one hit after the other, after the next. And one messenger would leave for the next one to come and give worse news, until where his children were all killed. In contrast to the indifferent, complacent attitude of these first 3 examples, Job said this in verse 21, "Naked came I out of my mother's womb, and naked shall I return thither. The Lord gave, and the Lord hath taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." Another man of God. All 4 of these were godly men. All 4 of these were invested in God's kingdom. What is going to make the difference in your life and in mine? Indifference, defined by Webster's, is simply marked by a lack of interest, enthusiasm, or concern for something. Apathetic, mediocre. Reminds me of the church in Revelation 3. "I know thy works, that thou art neither cold nor hot. I would thou wert cold or hot. So then, because thou art lukewarm, and neither cold nor hot, I will spew thee out of my mouth." What temperature is my life? As I endeavor to make a difference and to live a worthwhile, meaningful life invested into God's kingdom and for His glory, what passion consumes me, inspires me, and changes my life, so that after the inspiration of this morning, it energizes my life this afternoon and tomorrow. Making a difference. Jeremiah chapter 31 and verse 33. I invite you to turn there. This reminds me of last Sunday's sermon, of living in the Spirit. I want to highlight this verse as a key verse, instruction for how am I going to move beyond inspiration to make positive, passionate, to allow positive, passionate growth in my life. Remember, we want roots growing downward, and we want the fruit that is bearing upward and is displayed upward. We want that health. We want growth in both directions. And Jeremiah 31 and verse 33. Jeremiah 31 and verse 33. But this shall be the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel. After those days, saith the Lord, I will put my law in their inward parts and write it in their hearts, and will be their God, and they shall be my people. External reform alone will not produce positive, lasting change and growth in my life. God's law must be allowed to transform us from the inside out. The remnant that is escaped of the house of Judah shall yet again take root downward and bear fruit upward. That was a promise. There's going to be a remnant whose hearts are committed to God, that although the enemy is going to come and destroy and take your children captive, there is going to be a remnant who will come out of that experience and again bear fruit for God's kingdom. Our focus must not be fixed on circumstances or experience, rather on Jesus, the cross, and the Word. And I enjoyed some of this. I feel was covered already in our Sunday school discussion this morning. So I have 5 questions in closing, and then 5 directions after that. First of all, where are you at today? If you would measure your life with the thermometer God was using in Revelation chapter 3, what temperature would your life read on God's thermometer? He says, I'd rather have you cold than lukewarm. Cold in the sense that you have not yet experienced the divine nature. You are not born again. And so when you have not acknowledged your sin, you have every potential to be exposed to truth and to respond and to be born again and to be hot for God. And he said, but if you're warm, that means you've tasted, but you've cooled off. And you've said, you know what, my life is too difficult. Or else Hezekiah, you know, God, I've served you now for 39 years. And so I get this another chance. I get a second chance at life. I'm going to do things a little differently. Instead of going out there and having war against all of God's enemies and investing into his kingdom, I'm going to build houses to display my precious things. And I'm going to give tours to all my neighbors and to my friends from other countries to come over and see how amazing I've been. That's a real temptation. And so I'm barely lukewarm because I've fought the battle. You know what? As a congregation, we've made it to this point, and God has blessed us tremendously. And so we're going to sit back and we're going to just enjoy the blessings of what we have achieved. And we could become complacent or indifferent to say, you know what, as long as this congregation survives until I pass off the scenes, that's fine. You know, as long as I'm comfortable is what really matters. I'm tired. I'm sick of struggling. So quickly, we find ourselves focused on our own personal comfort. And we can very easily justify catering to ourselves. And somehow we can even identify our selfish tendencies and our selfish nature and make excuses for why we are entitled to feel this way. God, I've served you long enough and hard enough. I'm going to coast now. I'm just going to enjoy all these treasures and all the good stuff. Where are you today? Question number 2, what is your destination? In charting a course and you punch into Google Maps, I'm heading to Ridgetown on Friday. All right? Where's your current location? Detler Road. Okay? Fastest route is this bright blue line with no big red marks because we avoided the 401 and we went on the 407 because I want to stay comfortable. And still, we've defined our destination. We've defined where we're leaving. Are you going to accept the path? Third question. If you continue traveling in the direction you are headed today, this morning, will you accomplish your goals? If you continue traveling the direction you are headed this morning, will you reach the end destination? Fourth question, how selfish are you? How selfish are you? Fifth question, how can we implement passionate, positive growth in our personal lives, our families, our churches, and our communities? How can we implement passionate, positive growth in our personal lives, our families, our churches, and our communities? I have 5 suggestions now to share with you. Number 1, focus on who before trying to do. Focus on the who before trying to do. So quickly, I find myself, based on some very, very positive inspiration, to make a list of things I'm going to change. And so last Sunday morning, I am so inspired. And so Monday morning, my life is going to look like this. I'm going to do this, and this, and this, and this. And I make an entire list of expectations for myself because I'm so inspired about the beautiful time of worship we had. My desire, I think, is good, as is yours. I hate diets, just since, in case anyone didn't know that already. But I shouldn't enlarge on that too much. We'll get sidetracked here. But again, what am I trying to accomplish? Focusing on the things to do usually, very often, ends up in disappointment. Because even if we achieve immediate results, oftentimes those results are not long lasting. And so if I can force myself somehow to lose 10 pounds in the next 7 days, which would be a stretch, what's the chances that those pounds stay lost for the next 7 years? Just as an example, and there I've justified why I can hate diets. Instead, just love who you are. So focus on the who instead of trying to do. Now, that there's a balance in that. Once you understand who you want to become, and you worship with God daily, the way Job did, then that change is not necessarily very, very dramatic all at one time. Yes, if you're not a child of God and you're born again and you become a child of God, that is dramatic change. But for me to make a difference in my life, and then in my family, and in my church, and in my community, that is going to be a lifelong process of good choices that is changing not just my experience today, but my entire direction of travel to be aimed up with the goal instead of focusing only on the things to do. Now, of course, when you are changed in who you are because you focused on who, then the things that you do are going to be a natural outworking of who this person is. And so if I'm a dad this morning that is really out of line in my family and doing things that I really am not to be doing in my family, as I change and become more who God wants me to be, obviously my actions will change as well. Focus on who before trying to do. Number 2, choose your destination and commit to the path. Choose the destination and commit to the path. Number 3, identify your selfish tendencies as sin. No excuses. Identify your selfish tendencies as sin. Number 4, and one of my all-time favorites, live for the audience of one. Living for the audience of one, and that one being Jesus Christ, removes the pressures of your life being built on the expectations that you place on yourself or placed on you by others. Live for the audience of one. And number 5, live every day as if it were your last. Think of Hezekiah. He was given the message, he thought he was going to die. And so, in response to that, and a natural response, I guess, is he rolled over in his bed towards the wall and he cried. And that's fine. That would be a natural response to getting that message. He had dreams, he had ideals, he had goals to accomplish. He had a different idea of what he deserved. What if today was the first day of the 15 years that God had given me to live? And what if tomorrow is day 2 of 15 years that I have left? Where's my treasure going to be? In those earthly storehouses that he took great pleasure in bringing his neighboring friends to come and tour? What if tomorrow is a countdown for the last 15 years of your life? How would you live? Hezekiah was given another 15 years, some of which were dedicated to serving himself. Positive growth takes time. Positive growth is a slow process. And so it takes patience. Turn with me in closing to Job chapter 1. I want to highlight what, as I studied, what I felt was a key to his passion in spite of the most difficult collection of circumstances that I could even start to imagine. Let's see in Job chapter 1, the who of Job before this happened, which no doubt led directly and was connected directly to his response when he prayed, "The Lord gave and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." let's read verse 5 of chapter 1. And it was so, when the days of their feasting were gone about, that Job sent and sanctified them, and rose up early in the morning, and offered burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, "It may be that my sons have sinned and cursed God in their hearts." And now this is the sentence I want to leave with you. Thus did Job continually. Thus did Job continually. I love inspiration. I love coming to church on a Sunday morning and leaving being so encouraged and so inspired to continue. Thus did Job continually. This was a way of life. This was not an exception that, well, you know what, I did this on this day, and I touched in with God this morning, and then my entire life was destroyed in the next several hours and days. Thus did Job continually. Also, I'd like to read a verse that Colin shared with us this morning. 2 Corinthians 4, verse 16, and I was really blessed by this as God's signature again this morning, being interested on inspiring Colin's thoughts and mine. 2 Corinthians 4:16, for which cause we faint not, but though our outward man perish, yet the inward man is renewed day by day. Let's have a closing song.